So we want to understand the intersection between the domestic and the international common good. I think we especially want to understand it in our own day so as we can better know how to act in order to advance the common good in the circumstances in which we exist. And I think to understand, there's this British author who, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago now, wrote this book, Strange Rebels, 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. His name is Christian Caryll. And in that book, he kind of begins the book by just listing a number of events that took place in 1979. In 1979, the People's Republic of China and the United States established formal diplomatic relations. That same year, Deng Xiaoping acknowledges the failure of socialism and says that China should emulate bourgeois countries. February of 79, the Iranians deposed the Shah. June of 79, Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell found the moral majority. Also in June of 79, John Paul II arrives in Warsaw to say Mass for 1 million Poles. Paul Volcker in 79 becomes the head of the Federal Reserve. Also in 79, the Irish Republican Army commits one of its last terrorist actions, blowing up a boat that has the Viceroy of India on it. There was a kind of dramatic moment in November of 79 when Islamic militants seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Also in 79, you get the beginning of the famous hostage crisis, the Iranian students that stormed the American embassy in Iran and take 66 members hostage. And then December 79, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And I would argue that Caryll is kind of a Hegelian. I think he's trying to see, it's like a Whig Hegelianism, I think. He's trying to see these various movements of history as resulting in ultimately some sort of understanding of neoliberalism, neo-economic liberalism as definitely the future, and that all of these events somehow explain the future. He also sees these events to some degree as reactions against what had come before in the 1960s and 70s. And I would argue that that you could see it would be better. It would be better to see what's going on here as a religious revolt against materialism, right? Against liberalism. And I think that's the mistake that Caryll makes in his own analysis. But being a writer from The Economist, what would you expect? I would argue that if you look at what defines like the 60s and the 70s in domestic politics in the United States, in the late 60s, you get the breakup of the civil rights movement. The leadership that tends to be like East Coast Jewish leadership and the black leadership of the South, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King, that alliance breaks up. This is documented in Murray Friedman has written a book about this, which is a very insightful book. Also, after this happens, Harold Cruz writes a book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, in which, actually just yesterday, there was a black commentator, Robert Johnson. He's the namesake of the famous blues guitarist. But Robert Johnson said he kind of went on this diatribe, like all these people taking down statues, that never results in good things for black people, right? That this is all just posturing. It's nice politics, but that doesn't bring us jobs. That doesn't bring us equality in the workplace. It's all just, so he really, and I think that's essentially the the attitude of Harold Cruse in the book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And Murray Friedman also describes this in his book, that there was this real sense by the late 60s among black leadership that they really got nothing materially or economically out of the civil rights movement. So there was a break, it broke up. Also, by the end of the 60s, you get, for example, just in culture, right, you get the end of the production code. So that there's no you can show any movie you want in movie houses in the early 70s. And so, for example, the top selling movies, I think in 72, 73 are pornographic films, right? I think by the end of the 70s, there's a backlash against this. I think Richard Nixon saw this backlash coming. I think because Richard Nixon saw this backlash coming, my uncle was a regular guest at the White House in the late 60s, early 70s. Because, so there's one of the advisors of Nixon, his name is Kevin Phillips. And this is especially clear. He wrote a book called The Emerging Republican Majority. And he wrote this book, I think, in 67 or 68. And I think Nixon, in this aspect, took it as his guidebook. And Phillips, especially in the first edition of the book, later editions, this kind of gets edited out. But it's really clear in the first edition of the book. Phillips says, you can, right now, Catholics vote like 80%, 90% Democrat in national elections. The Democratic Party is going to go over, they're going to accept and embrace the sexual revolution. They're already doing it. So that's going to be an opportunity to gain at least half of the vote of the Catholics in national elections. And if all you have to do to gain that vote is you have to, soften any kind of stance that would sound like you're going along with the sexual revolution. So just, at least in electoral politics, to have a little bit more of a pro-family, eventually pro-life platform, and you'll win. At some point, you'll win half the Catholic vote. And so Nixon, I don't think he fully adopts that plan, but I think he works to get that plan into the Republican platform. And then I think by the time you get to Reagan and his advisors, they fully implement that plan. There's always been a question whether that plan was genuinely implemented or cynically implemented, right? That whether the leadership was thinking, well, this is a electoral strategy that doesn't need to be translated into any definitive policy, or we can translate it into policy in minimalistic type ways, but ways that would never actually overturn, like Roe v. Wade, right? So you see happening in domestic politics, for example, I think in part, in the mid to late 80s, there were all these movements of almost revolutionary pro-life movements that were, that were on the verge. Some of them seemed to be on the verge of almost going a little bit like creating instability, breaking down Concord. Randall Terry was a figure who was in charge of a number of the Operation Rescue. It got big coverage in the late 80s. Randall Terry showed up out of the blue, out of nowhere. He showed up when I was at Notre Dame in 2009, organizing the circus around Obama's visit to Notre Dame. So this is a guy that came out of nowhere. It seems like he was nowhere for 30 years, and then all of a sudden, boom, or 20 years, and then all of a sudden, he shows up. So, but I think you can see what happens is that in 1980, also, and we just pointed out to this, in 79, the moral majority forms. The moral majority is essentially the evangelical Christians returning to American political life. And evangelical Christians return to American political. There's a great book by a guy from Detroit, Zev Shafetz, where he kind of documents, and he does interviews with a lot of these evangelical Christians who kind of came together and formed the moral majority. I used to read his book in some of my classes, and I think it was very fair and insightful. But he would document how many of them were getting involved in politics by this time because they were pro-life. So that they had that going, which they agreed with Catholics. They were also super pro-Israel. And you can see, it's really interesting if you study the history of biblical translations and commentaries. In the evangelical world, you can go back to the Scofield Bible, which one of the first translations is in the early 20th century. I think it was 1908 or something like that. And you can see in the commentaries is where you start to get the first, like in the commentaries in Romans and then the commentaries in some of the Old Testament, in some of those footnotes, you start to see the first indications ever in the history of biblical scholarship that somehow Israel should be given, there should be a state of Israel. It should be given back to the Jews, and that will be the beginning of the end times, right? So this commentary starts to get put in the Scofield Bible in the early 20th century. And then in the 1960s, there's an update to the Scofield Bible, in which essentially they insert into the commentary that it's anti-Semitic to not support the state of Israel. And that somehow it's biblically so important that it's anti-Semitic to not support the state. So Shafetz shows that this coalition that came together to support Reagan in 1980, they were united by a number of things. They were united by their concern for religion, at least allowing for public life in the United States. And so that brought together Catholics and evangelical Christians. They were pro-life. They were anti-communist, right? So that brought together Catholics, evangelical Christians. It also brought together, obviously, a big chunk of just the foreign policy establishment. And it also brought together part of that foreign policy establishment was the rising neoconservatives, who all these groups wanted to bring some sort of an end to the Cold War. They all had different agendas, how to bring that Cold War to an end. There are some people that speculate that actually the Bush family, so George Bush, who was the vice president of Reagan, some say that, and I've never looked into this in any kind of great detail, but there are some who argue that Bush wanted the Cold War to continue, that he actually he never really saw how it could end. So he was more on the side of just let it continue. I mean, it's a nice framework for controlling the world from a geopolitical standpoint.
He was former CIA.
He was the head of the CIA. Yeah. He was ousted by Carter, and then he and the people that got ousted by Carter, they formed what was called the Safari Club, right, where they would meet in Africa on these hunting expeditions, and they would talk about using the contacts they still had to still try to keep the world in order before Carter destroyed it. So that's the most charitable interpretation I could put on what they did. So because Reagan. So I have a friend who intervened in the Reagan administration because he was convinced that Reagan was surrounded by advisors who were either George Bush or neoconservatives, and they did not want to see the Cold War end, or they wanted to end it violently. And so basically, but I think you can see what happens at the beginning of the Cold War is that John Paul II comes to power, and I think so. When I was in my little conversation with Cardinal Stafford in Rome in 2015, I kind of said this to Cardinal Stafford, and I also told this. I also talked with this one fellow in the State Department who had been working in the State Department in the Vatican going back to the 80s. And I kind of said this to him. I said, it's my impression that, John Paul II cut a deal with the American political establishment in the early 1980s, that we would work together because solidarity came up, they cracked down on solidarity. John Paul II went to Poland. He convinced the leaders in solidarity to not go violent. And then I think he worked with the American regime, right, to work on cultural ways to bring down communism in Poland, right? especially after John Paul II's Mass there in 1979. I think they saw an opening to where they could, and I think they saw at some point it would be very dramatic and very symbolically significant to bring down Poland using a labor union, right? To bring down a communist system using a labor union and the leader of a labor union. So my friend who got involved in all this, he became convinced at some point that Reagan wanted to do this. He wanted to try to bring down Poland somehow and bring down the communist system in Russia. But all of his advisors they either wanted to keep the Cold War going, or they were just pushing for some sort of violent end to the Cold War. Some even going for nuclear weapons. So my friend became convinced that the only way to put an end to this is that he would have to come up with a scheme to get Reagan and Gorbachev to talk to each other without their advisors around. So I may have mentioned this in this class before, how he...
We did get together with him, right?
Yeah, we had to get there with him 2 years ago. Yeah. So they came up with this scheme of... The guy they told the scheme to in Russia, he, at the time, was just an intellectual in the think tank of Russia. But then, a few weeks later, he was the foreign minister of Russia. And so he was able to put together this first meeting between Reagan and his wife and Gorbachev and his wife that brought an end. It kind of put in motion the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So, you can see, so what happens after the Cold War kind of winds down, and I'm kind of just brushing through things here, but after the Cold War winds down, well, then there's this new debate, like, what will the new world order look like? And I think to understand the standpoint of the church on this, you have to go back to Taparelli. You have to go back to the 19th century. Because Taparelli and Catholic social thinkers in the 19th century, they essentially began arguing even back then, look, if the world is going to be organized in a truly international way, right? That you can understand the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity in such a way that you could just as we discovered that there are laws that are appropriate for a nation, like so Taparelli and then von Ketteler and then Heinrich Pesch, they all became convinced, and they all started, and also, Catholic politicians in various nations in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, they became convinced that there were genuine areas of interest that the nation state should care for. Like protecting the economy of the nation, establishing wages in the nation that are consummate with the level of the workforce, with the cultural, and this whole idea of building up, like this whole I guess now sometimes it gets described as development, but you can see over time in different societies how there's a level of the culture of the worker, the education of people, right? The dynamic of the economy, what kind of jobs, you can move from a subsistence economy to an agrarian economy, to an industrial economy, to an advanced industrial economy, right? That there's ways and it's the government ultimately that has a kind of say over this. One of their concerns in the late 19th, early 20th century, which is always a concern in the history of political philosophy, is what do you do with institutions that acquire so much wealth that they can, through their wealth, exercise more power than the governments, right? So it's one thing, just to give an example, like in this country, I've heard this statistic thrown around, I haven't looked into it, 60% of the small business owners and entrepreneurs are Catholic, right? And who knows how many people are in the 1% or the 0.1% or whatever it is, but both those 60% owners that are Catholic, small business owners, and then the 0.1%, they both might argue for like less government control, right? But for very different reasons, right? The 0.1% is that oftentimes sometimes that gets called the rentier class. Thorstein Veblen would call them the absentee owners, right? These groups of people, or these groups, or these foundations, or these corporations that acquire so much wealth that they essentially can become stronger than nations. There's one, Blackstone, I think now services $27 trillion of the debt of nations, right? Which, I mean, just as a thing of, if wealth can translate into power, that could translate into significant power more than many nations could exercise against Blackstone.
Blackstone or BlackRock?
I think Blackstone. BlackRock is in the same club, right? They're both up there. So the concern of the Catholic thinkers at this time was, well, the nation should have some control over wealth, because otherwise wealth will organize in independent of the political order to influence in a way that might be excessive or oligarchical, right? So the argument of the church has always been that it might be sloppy, it might take some time to figure out, but applying the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity in an international order, you could probably be able to figure out what areas are the subject of international law that would still respect the nation, and then the smaller state, and then the family, right? That you can have a multi-layered political economic order where the political regime is passing laws that are commensurate with the kind of activity that's taking place. So that if you have this international rentier class, so one of the questions of our time is, how do you regulate the international order? Is it simply organized by force, by power? Or should there be, or could there be mechanisms, political mechanisms, or are there other kinds of mechanisms that could be exercised that would regulate the international order according to justice and not force? Right, that's kind of I think that's the question where the Vatican is kind of trying to press the issue. It's interesting if you ever get interested in these questions. I think it's helpful to understand at some point how Vatican congregations work, right? Just because someone's on a Vatican congregation doesn't mean that the Vatican is necessarily promoting that guy's ideas, though obviously sometimes there are people on the Vatican congregations that try to act that way, right? So Jeffrey Sachs is a great example of that. You'll hear people in the news talk these days about, oh, Jeffrey Sachs, he's on the Vatican, for congregation for social sciences or something like that. And apparently he is very influential, right? And apparently he does have a lot of say on who gets appointed to the Vatican Council, especially from America, for the Vatican Congregation on Social Sciences. But a lot of times they say that as if this has just happened, but he's been on that congregation. He's been working in the Vatican since the late 80s, right? He was an advisor on Centesimus Annus, right? It's not a new thing. I mean, again, you can criticize him all you want. I'm prone to criticize him too for many reasons, but he's been around a lot longer than the last 2 years, right? So sometimes you'll hear these sensationalist stories like Jeffrey Sachs has met Pope Francis, Well, he also met Benedict, and he also met John Paul II. But sometimes these guys are on these congregations, and ultimately, there's one guy that is a consultant, Emanuel Wallerstein. And I think the reason he's a consultant is that he always writes about the world system. Right? He's one of the few political scientists I've seen that is really trying to always write. He's trying to theorize, what's the world system supposed to look like? And he's not just like George Bush. This is, George Bush after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He gave the speech in which he announced the beginning of the New World Order. And every once in a while, a politician will use that term. I think recently some politician in Chicago just said, I don't want any police officer in my police force unless he's willing to accept the New World Order. you know, and then people get scared of the New World Order. And there might be some people, you know, there might be some bad individuals who are trying to promote the New World Order in that way. But so I think, but I guess just to say something here, right? I think there was a kind of, so when I talked with both my friend in the State Department and also with Cardinal Stafford, I think John Paul II had this hope that if he kind of coddled up, for lack of a better word, with the American foreign policy establishment to bring about an end to communism, that then when he turned around and he criticized Western materialist capitalism, because I think obviously the 80s, a lot of his social teaching was dedicated towards understanding human work, understanding the rights of labor, understanding the nature of the economy. I think primarily with a view towards a critique of the Soviet Union. But I think at the same time, he was trying to cultivate principles that could eventually be a critique of Western economic liberalism, however you want to understand that. I think you can see him start to develop in speeches he gives in Poland in the late 1990s. What he was hoping to develop into a kind of more full intellectual critique, and a kind of a full intellectual critique that would encompass abortion, but it wouldn't be only on abortion. It would be more ecological, to use that term. I think he also started using this language of moral ecology. I don't think in the sense of like we want to just start chaining ourselves to trees, but I think more in the sense that he thought that from the standpoint of respect for nature, respect for the environment, respect for nature, you could extend that to the human person at some point. And you could say, well, if there's an ecology for the earth, there's a moral ecology. So I think he was trying to come up with a way of how do you articulate the fullness of morality in a way that people will accept it. I think especially in a way that the liberal left will accept it. Right? Is there a way to I think Benedict had the same concern. You can see the speech he gave to the Swiss bishops right after he was elected Pope. There was a day where he was meeting with the Swiss bishops. They forgot to give him his notes. So he couldn't speak the canned speech he normally gives. So he just spoke from the heart. Those are always very revealing moments. Right? And essentially that's what Benedict said to them. He said, we have to find a language that will convince Western elites, I think by that he meant Western liberal elites, to basically come back to morality about the human person and the family. And maybe the way to do that would be so many Western elites are interested in ecology, maybe moral ecology, respect for the environment, moral ecology. Maybe that could be a way of meeting them linguistically, meeting them where they are to try to draw them to, the more robust Catholic morality. So I think that John Paul II was hoping that especially Catholic American intellectuals who are Catholic, who are public intellectuals, that they would join him in this endeavor. And I think when the American political establishment, the Catholic political establishment, I think when they balked on him with the Iraq War, and they basically wrote against him publicly with the Iraq War, I think that really broke up in the eyes of the Vatican. That broke. Like if every revolution leads to a civil war, because the two sides don't have everything in common. Well, if there was a revolution in '79 along religious ideals that brought together, the Reagan Revolution that led to collaboration between the Vatican and the U.S., I think 2002, 2003 broke that, especially the Iraq War. And at that point, I think after that point, the Vatican lost any kind of hope that American Catholic intellectuals would back them up on this more robust critique, because they were too wedded to their political attachments and the political compromises that they had made in the American context. Then I think I think always the left, the Catholic left, was lost because they refused to go back on the sexual revolution. So I think they were holding out for the more, let's say, conservative Catholics, that they would embrace more of the fullness of Catholic morality in public life. I think the Iraq War broke that alliance, and it hasn't been reforged. And I think you can see a lot of things coming out of the Vatican now as a sign that they just don't have any real confidence in the leading Catholic public intellectuals from the United States, that they're really on board with this more robust, holistic, helping to develop this more robust, holistic view that John Paul II was hoping for. And of course, no one has articulated it yet. That's an area waiting to be exploited. That's an area that we can still, that we're waiting for the Scheeben, the Matthias Scheeben, to come along, who can create that new synthesis. And
John Doherty.
pardon?
John Doherty.
John, help us, John Doherty. You are our only hope. Help us, John Doherty. You are our only hope.
Trust your feelings.
That's what we do.
Help us, Obi-Wan. You're our only hope. Right? I think also, so the other thing, I was saying this the other day, but I think also it's the case that the left, it's interesting that the transformation the left has undergone since the 1980s. I mean, the left used to be more pacifistic in its approach. And what you see happening from the 80s to the now is it's become more Foucaultian, right? In other words, it embraces the empire, but it embraces the empire to advance the agenda of the sexual revolution, which is identity politics, along with advancing the agenda of, the big corporations, the FANG corporations, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Gulag, right? Facebook, Crapple, Netflix, and Gulag.
How's that apple?
I bought it before I was aware of FANG.
I didn't know what that was.
Sorry, Miguel first, and then Dan.
Do you think, though, that conservative Catholics are breaking their political ties given failure to deliver conservative politics in the past?
Yeah, so I would say a big so a big surprise for me. So you could see in 92, from 92 to 90. So one of the things that happened from 92 to 96 is that Pat Buchanan kind of represented a kind of conservative Catholicism that wanted to be more kind of on the side of the working man and against an aggressive foreign policy, but keep strong on social issues. And one of the purposes of a mid-year election where your party's going to lose is you discipline your party for future elections. So you can see from 92 to 96, like Bob Dole, especially in 96. I think one of him and one of the things he does in that election is that he basically disciplines or kicks out or humiliates the Pat Buchanan conservative. So they don't basically, and then what happens is that they go underground for 20 years. And then when I go to Rome in 2012, there's really none of that stuff going on. But then when I came back from Rome in 2016, it's like the ghost of Christmas past has returned, right? You see the creation of the Josias Report. You see all these Catholic intellectuals, mostly younger, who are basically bucking this alliance that had been made among the previous generation of Catholic intellectuals, right? And I think you can say that. I mean, I think Trump, that he tapped into that. He tapped into the Catholic, the Pat Buchanan conservative, which is kind of how he got to power in 2016. I'm not saying that he theoretically tapped into it. I think he somehow became aware of it. I think that's what he tapped. But then you can see, at least what I think I see, is I see, the textbook I just gave you for the class, right? The integralism textbook, the Josias report, which is real, like among the Catholic students at Harvard, is like they all read it. And then this thing that just came out this summer, Use at Justitium, in response to these Supreme Court cases, right? The whole attempt to renew, I think Joe Baristas told me this morning that he was in a little conversation with Justice Alito, and Justice Alito said to this group of students that, I basically adopted originalism because I think that's what the party wanted of me as I came of age as a judge. But I'm becoming more and more convinced we need to become natural law legal theorists. That's the next step, right? Alito was telling this to all these Ivy League students 2 weeks ago, according to the account of Joey Baristas.
I'm wanting Vietnam.
You're an impartial observer. We know you're the impartial observer. You're the de Tocqueville.
I'm the spine.
You're the de Tocqueville. You're the de Tocqueville of 2016. So I think that's interesting, right? That, so for example, just to bring up recently this summer, just to bring up the notion of the common good, to say this is a standard by which we can engage in debate, right? That's huge. That when I couldn't do that in the 90s as a graduate student in any kind of serious way. So that's a big change.
Sorry, say what?
So the article that was written this summer on common good constitutionalism, Vermeulen, where he promotes common good constitutionalism, he's renewing a debate that goes back to before the 1990s. But there were some things about the common good in the 90s, but no one of significance would I know of a dissertation that was written in the late 80s, early 90s on Aquinas and the common good. But it was by a political philosophy professor who's, not prominent. But then for someone who's prominent to actually, take the common good seriously and say we can develop a whole legal theory based on it. I mean, that's a big step, I think, in the right direction. But I don't think someone could have taken that step in the 90s. But I think somehow he's taking the step now, and he's getting reception.
Younger scholars.
Yeah, mostly among the younger scholars, because they haven't made any compromises yet. So the older scholars, they've still made their compromises. So they're gonna stick with their compromises. I think they're gonna stick with the deals they made in the 80s. And the deal in the 80s was we'll only elect originalist judges. Because that's the worst, that's the least bad of all the evils out there.
So could I ask a question?
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back to Foucault. What was his main motivation?
His main motivation was to implement the religion of George Bataille. Which is a religion of, basically, it's kind of a demonic religion that tries to cut off the head of reason so that we can organize a society based on identity groups in which each person can identify himself and his own existence. And as it turns out, the center of power that you always have to do away with is the Catholic Church.
Now, if you're studying Foucault, is this clear? I mean, do the 80% of the people writing dissertations, do they know that he's tied to?
No, so for example, like my friend Guido Preparata, who wrote the book on Foucault, he precisely notes that Foucault himself was very cautious in ever mentioning George Bataille in his own writings. But there's like one speech that he gives at an important moment in his career. There's one speech he gives. And in that speech, he essentially says, I owe all my foundational ideas to George Bataille. And I'm implementing in a way that's rational and that people will accept what he set out to do. So then what Guido does is he says, okay, what did Bataille set out to do? And then how does this help us to understand Foucault? Because by Foucault's own admission, it's an aspect of Foucault that most of his followers are ashamed to admit. It's like most followers of Descartes are ashamed to admit that the foundation of his philosophy is a couple of crazy dreams he had when he in between tours of duty in the religious wars of Germany. And most Cartesian scholars, even at the time of Descartes spoke very highly of those dreams and how he interpreted them as the basis of his philosophical project. But most of his followers were ashamed that those dreams were the basis of his philosophical project. Maritain has this great book called The Three Reformers, and this other one called The Dream of Descartes, in which he does that. He says he basically goes to the dream, and he shows you. I think it's Maritain's best book, but he shows you how Descartes himself interpreted his dream, and how a crazy dream led to Cartesian philosophy. So I think there's a similar thing going on with Foucault. So there's two aspects of Foucault's career that his disciples don't know what to do. Well, there's three aspects of his career that his disciples don't know what to make out of, and so they tend to downplay it. One is his affinity for George Bataille. Second is why he supported the Iranian Revolution. And third is why he started teaching Austrian economics when he went to Berkeley in the late 70s, early 80s. But I think you can explain that by he knew that he was making a pact, that he knew he was somehow making a pact where he realized, I'm gonna get the left to give up economic justice and pacifism. And in exchange for that, we'll get unrestrained sexual pleasure. So in other words, the old tension that was started under Karl Marx of this kind of, sexual liberation, economic justice, do those things go together? That finally, I think it's resolved by Foucault, where he basically says, forget about economic justice. It's all power and identity politics. I don't think most of his followers are capable of putting this together. But I think Guido put it together. And there's a nice summary of that in the last chapter of this book also.
What's that book called? Not that book.
Guido's book?
Yeah.
Ideology of Tyranny. It has a subtitle, but it's Guido Preparata, Ideology of Tyranny.